Have you completed your resume, but it isn't getting much traction? Or are you getting ready to start your resume from scratch? In either case, this course is for you. I'll be covering everything you need to know about creating your resume or modifying your resume if you already have one. Once you have made the changes to your resume or created a brand new one, you will be ready to start applying for jobs. My name is Amanda with the Workforce Centers of South Central Kansas, and I'll be sharing how to get a better response from your resume. I've outlined this in 4 steps. The first step to reflect on your own work history. The second step to analyze the job description as well as your work history. The third step to strategize. So that's looking at your work experience, the job description, and to figure out how you can best market yourself. And step 4, how to actually use the template. You may be asking yourself, why are we not immediately getting on the computer to begin our resume? There's millions of templates out there. All we have to do is just input our information. And so one thing that I always like to do is set the expectation that your resume really does involve a lot more thought process. You want to customize this resume to really wow the employer. That's going to result in more calls back for interviews. So how many resumes do you think you'll need? You're actually going to probably need a new resume for almost every single job you apply to. Now, this may not mean that you're creating a completely different resume. It may mean that there's just some minor changes that are made to make your resume a better fit for the position that you're applying to. And we're going to talk more about that in a moment. So what's the difference then between a resume and an application? Often I'd get the question, why do I need to do a resume if I filled out the application, or vice versa? And really, when it comes down to it, an application is your legally binding document. That's what they're going to run the background check on, for example. Your resume is a marketing tool. And so that does mean that sometimes there may be some variations between your resume and application. The application may ask for you to put the last 10 years of all the places that you've worked. Your resume, you have a little bit more flexibility about what jobs you put on there and how you format it, etc. What is an applicant tracking system? And this is a really great question, and it's one to understand so that way you can actually do your part to help get your resume through the applicant tracking system so you can get a call back for an interview. An applicant tracking system, in layman's terms, is like a robot. It's going to scan your resume and it's going to be looking for it to match a certain percentage in order to get passed on to a human eye. And so it's looking for keywords. You're going to need to understand how to construct your resume to make it through the applicant tracking system so that way you have better chances of getting that call for the interview. Here's a better visual of the applicant tracking system. What it is going to do, it is going to filter out all of the applicants and only send over a few to the HR professionals. As you see, the applicant tracking system actually screens out about 98% of all applications. Only 2% get moved forward. To really put it into a number perspective, most corporate jobs attract about 250 resumes easily. Out of that, they will choose 4 to 6 people to be interviewed, and only one will actually get the job. Before we continue, I'd like to get a good understanding, or have you guys have a good understanding of some terminology that I'll be using. And so I'm going to call this resume drafting terminology. There is such a thing as a master resume. Now, this master resume you would never send on to an employer. It is really used kind of like a cheat sheet for yourself. So this is where ideally you would want to list all of your work history, come up with all of the dates, all of the duties. You might even include, their phone number and address, because this could help you with completing applications as well. That way you don't have to go back and look up phone numbers or addresses, etc. And from here, you can then choose information that is relevant to the job you're applying to when you construct the resume for that position. So this is more or less just factual information to help you in constructing your resume or applying to jobs. If you can't go back your entire work history, try to at least go back the last 10 years. And then we have the foundational resume. And what I consider a foundational resume is a generic resume, one you have not customized for the employer, but it's a pretty good general resume. For example, if you went to a job fair and you didn't know who was going to be there, you could hand this to them and it would have either your most recent work history on it. It would have either industry specific history on it. It would be filled out entirely, but it may not necessarily best market you to the employer because you haven't targeted it to the job or the employer, which brings me to the next one. And so that is a targeted resume. And that's really what you're striving for. You're striving to target a resume so that way it makes it through the applicant tracking system. That means it's going to have the keywords in it that are important for that particular job, to show off your skills. And the targeted resumes will have a better chance of getting you that call back for the interview. And sometimes that means you are literally just changing some of the verbiage to match the verbiage in the job description or the skills that would be appropriate, relevant for that job. I hope that makes a little bit more sense about what a master resume would be, a foundational resume, and a targeted resume. The first step will be reflection. This reflection step will help you compile the information for that master resume and potentially could help you then target the targeted resume once you know what you're working with. This is where you may find that you have held jobs that are significant or relevant to the job that you're looking at applying to. And maybe it was kind of further back in your work history. And so you may have to see how you may be able to include that on your resume. Generally, you wouldn't go back any further than 10 years on your resume, only because of the fact that age discrimination isn't supposed to happen, but it still does. So ideally, you want to have an ageless resume. However, sometimes our work experience that may be a little bit older is completely relevant to the job that we want today. And so we have to figure that out. And we're going to talk about some of those strategies here as we move further throughout the slideshow. During this step, though, you are getting on paper where you've worked, the employers, your position titles. Sometimes maybe you had more than one title at an employer, what those duties were, and what those dates of employment were. During this stage, though, I don't want you to get too stuck on the formalities I really would like to see a rough draft. This is what's going to help you get everything out on paper for you. I encourage doing some type of map similar to this, thinking about where you had previously worked and doing a map for those employers, asking yourself, what did you do while you were there? Well, I was in customer service, I was a birthday party host, a cashier, a cook. And then usually that can give us kind of a working space to work off of. What I found is that a lot of times people will stop at those first bubbles, but that's going to be way too vague. So you do want to expound upon that a little bit further. So you can ask yourself questions. That's usually what I do to try to pull information out of, a customer that may not really know how to describe what they did. So what does customer service look like? What do you mean you performed customer service? Tell me exactly what you did. Sometimes we forget the minor things that we did on a day-to-day basis and don't realize that they may be actually really important to the next job. So customer service, for example, resolved customer complaints, greeted customers, answered questions. You'll notice each of those actually start with an action verb as well, and they are past tense. So I encourage, when you do complete your resume, we'll actually have you do bullet points and that you start with an action verb. Took orders, tendered payments, prepared salads, operated fryers. And from there, you can continue to expand if you think, you want to add additional information. Doing this step, not only does it help with getting ideas out for your resume, but it also kind of prepares you for the interview. And I don't know that a lot of people realize that, but just kind of going over this refreshes what skills you have so that you can talk about them in a better way once you do get that call for the interview. For example, on cleaned up, a way that you could expand on that is, okay, well, how did you clean up? What tools did you use? I used a broom, a mop, a vacuum. I had chemicals that I used, and so this can now help us get a more detailed sentence or bullet once we do our resume. As I mentioned before, I did encourage you to do that brainstorming, the reflection for each and every job that you held, or at least the last 10 years. Once you've done that, this is when you're going to move to step 2, which is to analyze. This step is going to help you draw conclusions so that you can better summarize your experience. You're looking for trends and similarities in your work history, as well as similarities between your experience and position in which you'll be applying. That's going to mean that you're not only looking at your maps that you've done and finding similarities and trends there, but you're also going to be analyzing that job description and seeing what things are similar from your work experience that are also listed in the job description. Identifying these trends and similarities will help you create your targeted resume to the employer. One thing it also may help you do is to recognize your transferable skills and to be able to summarize your strengths and expertise. As mentioned, you'd be analyzing the rough draft or your maps, where you would be noticing those trends and similarities to help identify your strengths or possibly transferable skills to summarize your experience. For example, if on my map I found that I had customer service as a bubble, not only when I worked at Burger King, but the YMCA, Newcom, it's a call center, and T-Mobile, for example. So I might say that, hey, I've got some pretty significant customer service experience. Then on my data entry, I noticed that I had that bubble on 3 of my maps and facilitation. And so from here, you're able to kind of get an idea of what you might use to summarize your experience. For example, one of my bullets could be over 10 years experience in customer service in the food industry, call centers, and nonprofits. You could come up with a sentence that will fully describe that work history. Could also help you come up with transferable skills. And we'll talk exactly of what transferable skills are. But for example, a transferable skill from facilitation might be public speaking. You're also going to analyze that job description. This is where you're going to identify this description. In the description, the skills that match your skill sets. So I encourage people to actually look at the job description and go through it and highlight all of the things that match. This is going to help you get an idea of what you need to make sure is included on your resume. Transferable skills, to give a little bit more detail on that. That is going to be skills that can be applied from one job to the next. Sometimes these transferable skills are a little bit more obvious than others. Here's some general transferable skills that are pretty basic that can be used across industries. For example, IT. So if you have computer experience, maybe it's not the same program you'd be using from T-Mobile to Newcom in my example, but they're both call centers. It's probably similar software, a similar platform to look up accounts, etc. So I probably would be able to learn that fairly quickly. That's just one example of how that could be a transferable skill. So it's not 100% match, but because I'm already familiar with using computers in a fast-paced environment, I probably would be an okay fit for that. Self-management, critical thinking. So being able to solve problems, that's something we do across industries many times. Information handling confidential information, working with numbers, managing our career, teamwork. Teamwork is something that is asked of us in most jobs as well, in addition to communicating and just being willing to learn. So those are some very general transferable skills. There is a video that also describes transferable skills pretty well. And that video can be found on YouTube. I'll go ahead and summarize it here. So that way I don't have a way to actually play the video in here. But if you type transferable skills in the workplace, it's a video by CityLine. It is available there. Essentially, what they recommend is that, you be strategically vague at times. The employer needs to picture you working in their environment. They also talk about how an employer only looks at your resume for like 6 or 7 seconds. So once it makes it past that robot, you're really going to have to wow them very, very quickly. So it's going to be important that you're able to help them see how you're a good fit for that job, and connecting the dots for them with your transferable skills is going to be extremely important. I can give you one kind of semi-personal example. I was teaching this course at one time, and a lady, she had done something in the entertainment industry where she was identifying people for roles to play in movies, etc. And now she was in a location that didn't really have that industry available, and was unsure of what she was going to do. But after looking at her resume, I was seeing that she was negotiating contracts. She was identifying people for specific roles. And so even though if I recommended, so I did recommend that maybe she look into potentially HR, even though she would not be finding somebody for a movie role, she'd still be determining who might be a good fit for a specific position. She's still going to have to negotiate, pay and benefits and, do all the legality and confidential paperwork and all of that stuff. So sometimes it may not be 100% match, as I mentioned before, but there are similarities between two totally different jobs that could then make you a good fit still. And so being able to explain that and with being strategically vague at the same time. So I do encourage watching this little video clip. Step 3, strategize. During this step, you'll be asking yourself some questions so that you can plan on how to best market yourself. Some of these questions might look like, what should I emphasize to help me stand out? What should I minimize not to cause any red flags or concerns for this employer? And what resume template works best to sell my work history? For example, emphasize. You may be good at some things, but how can you show that you really excel in that area? How can you show that you stand out from the rest of these other applicants? Think about your skills and characteristics that you possess that make you better than the average person for that position. Consider your accomplishments that you have to show for your performance. For example, maybe you've done customer service at a number of employers and you feel like that's a pretty strong skill set of yours. But how can you show that you are good at customer service and take it from being good at customer service or experienced in customer service to this person really excels at delivering excellent customer service? And so maybe you're talking about things like your ability to build rapport or to empathize with customers, or possibly, you were recognized at your last job for Outstanding Customer Service Award. These are things that would now set you apart from just the other applicants that also have tons of customer service experience if you're able to show specific accomplishments or characteristics that would make you better than the others that may also be applying for the same job. Minimizing. This is where you may want to kind of make it gloss over, if you will, the things that they may have red flags about or concerns about. And some of those things tend to be, you might be overqualified. Maybe you haven't worked in a while, or maybe you have job gaps, or maybe you are an older worker, as I mentioned in the beginning, that age discrimination does happen even though it's not supposed to. And so if there could be other areas of concern too, it's not just this, but these are the most common ones. So if this sounds familiar, these may be things that you want to try to hide so that they're not just so easily seen on paper, where you don't get a chance to explain or impress them with your personality. And so we can go into a little bit more in a moment here on some things that you might do to help minimize. Also, then this is where you're going to choose the template. The template can help you possibly with emphasizing or minimizing the areas in which you need to. Some templates work better than others, depending on your story. And everybody has a different story, so you have to think about which template is going to work best to sell your experience. And there's actually 3 different template types: chronological, functional, and combination. And we're going to talk more about those here in a moment. Step 4 will be the last step to complete your resume. Before completing your resume, there's some other tips and tricks that I'd like to bring to your attention so that you'd be more likely to be selected for an interview. Here are some resume basics for tips and tricks. Resume speak. You don't want to get too fancy or be too generic. You may have screwed in light bulbs for a living, but you're probably going to say something like you maintained lighting implements. There's a fine line between over glorifying things, but also having a little bit more resume or professional speak when creating your resume. Be specific where applicable and strategically vague otherwise. Use past tense for previous jobs, and remember those action verbs and keywords. When it comes to formatting, 1 page is best. Remember, they only look at your resume for about 6 seconds. Definitely no more than 2. You want to use bullet points. You want it to be real easy to read. You want to be consistent. So whatever kind of formatting you use, you'll want to make sure that it is the same. So your headers all one size, for example, the font, or if you bold certain things, you need to make sure that the pattern is consistent. Use font size between 10 and 12. Number 11 is actually the most read font size. If you start with 11, you can always go up or down to try to get it to that 1 page. And so I do recommend generally starting with font size 11. We also do not recommend using Times New Roman. It's kind of outdated, can show your age a little bit. And so we recommend using something that is easy to read. But here are a few suggestions: Calibri, Centric Gothic, Georgia, for example. You also need to make sure that you proofread and spell check. That is going to be a major turnoff to an employer if there are any type of errors. But not just running the spell check on your computer or just you looking it over. Encourage somebody else to look at it. You know, Walmart may be looking for stalker, but they're not looking for an STALKER. And your spell check is not going to pick that up. The career profile, but it's sometimes also referred to as summary of qualifications or professional profile. It's going to be used in place of the old objective statement. It's something that's also outdated. And so we encourage you not to have an objective statement, but instead to use a career profile, which is about 3 to 5 bullet points. You would think about why the employer should hire you, your skills and abilities. And I generally start that first bullet off with some type of summary of the number of years experience in the industry. For example, on this little graphic we have here, this is something I just copied an image off of the internet. And so there are some things that are done very well, and there's some things that I would tell you to change about this. So I'll use that as an example. I love the first bullet: registered nurse with 7 years experience in private practice, hospital, and hospice environments. Now, when you are using bullets, you're not supposed to put a period at the end, so I would recommend removing that period. Experienced charge nurse for a major hospital. And what I like about this is she's not saying she has leadership skills specifically, but she is saying that. And so that's kind of those skills, rock star skills. How can you emphasize that you're a really good fit for this position? And so she is doing that with that statement. She also talks about her strong analytical skills, including assessing conditions and implementing appropriate intervention. And then she goes on to say she was a trainer and educator for both peers and patients. So again, that's another thing that talks about her leadership skills. But besides working with patients, it also tells me she probably has patience. And so sometimes we can say things without saying them. And so try to get you a really good career profile that will bring attention to why you'd be a great fit, the best fit, should I say, for the job. References do not go on your resume any longer, so don't even put references upon request on the paper as well. You are going to want to make sure you're using professional references over personal. Be sure to get your permission to use them as a reference. And then also include email addresses. A lot of times they're sending this reference out via email now versus necessarily calling them. And some applications won't even let you complete them without having your reference email address. So I encourage you to call your reference to make sure that you have their permission to use them and get all of their updated information. The most common resume mistakes include that it's too long or too short. And we know now that it needs to be no more than 2 pages, ideally 1. Disorganized or poor formatting, and using our templates or a tool that can help with the formatting is recommended, including personal or unrelated information. If you're listing your age, marital status, hobbies, those kinds of things are not for your resume. In fact, it kind of puts them in an awkward position because if they choose to not look at your resume, it could be because of something that they disclose. So they really prefer those things not to be on your resume. Poor descriptions of experience. The good news is I'm going to show you a tool that will help you get some really good descriptions of your experience. And if you go through that mapping step I showed you in the beginning, that should help kind of give you some better ideas of how to describe as well. Sending an unfocused or generic resume. You're going to be much better off sending out 10 resumes that are targeted than 100 very generic ones. Repetitiveness. Sometimes people use the same word like performed, etc. And so you want to avoid that. It may be in the style of template you choose to that can help reduce some repetitiveness. And I'll talk about that here in a moment. You don't want to have an unprofessional email address. So if you have an email address that's questionable, recommend you get a brand new email address for your job search, as well as you don't want to have any typos or poor grammar within your resume. We'll talk about the resume template specifically now. I'm going to start with the chronological template. You'll notice here at the top of this template, we got the name, nice and big in bold letters. That's perfect. Addresses, like the actual physical address, like 101 North Main Street, for example, that is actually kind of becoming outdated as well. So now people are only putting their city, state, and zip on their resume, since they don't usually send out any communications via mail any longer, and somebody could potentially discriminate you based on where you live. So the kind of new way of doing things is leaving your physical address completely off. Phone number, email address, and then they actually included their LinkedIn as well, and that's perfectly okay and encouraged. They do have something here. It's not quite an objective statement, but it looks like there's some type of other eye catcher header there. Social media manager kind of describes them as a marketing way of being able to add a little bit more detail. You can either choose to have something like that, or you can remove that. The career profile would be next, and that is something that I do encourage that you keep. That's the 3 to 5 bullet points. And so here's another example of what that could look like. And then they have their work experience. And so with the chronological, it goes in reverse chronological order. Their most recent employment and then the employment before that. So the advantage for an employer is they can easily see your progression. So maybe you started at McDonald's and now you're working somewhere else, and they can easily see job gaps as well, which if you have job gaps, that may not be to your advantage. And so that can be the disadvantage for you. And so if you have job gaps, the chronological may not actually be the best way to show or sell your work history. And then we move down to education, and you'll list the important, relevant education. You're generally not going to put any dates for your education. As we mentioned before about age discrimination, there's a few things that can potentially tell your age right here on your resume. And so you want to make sure that it is an ageless resume. One thing is your email. So whether you have a year after, like Jane Doe 1942, for example, at Yahoo or AOL or at sbcglobal.net, that could potentially age you. All of those that are listed are kind of older email addresses. And so we do recommend that you use a Gmail account. The other thing that could potentially age you is on a chronological, if we are putting the exact years that you work somewhere, maybe you did work somewhere for 20 years or 30 years. And so that could potentially age you on the chronological resume. Many times, if you have worked somewhere for 20 or 30 years, I talked about the first bullet point being like over 10 years experience in XYZ. Sometimes people will say over 30 years experience in XYZ. So really don't use any more than 10, even if you have the 30 years. I know you're proud of that, but that could be telling of your age. And so granted, they're going to obviously see that you may not necessarily be just out of high school or whatnot when you go to the interview, and that's perfectly fine. At least now you're in front of them and you can sell yourself, your personality, your skills, wow them, get them to like you as a person, or on paper they can easily just move on to the next because they have no idea who you are. So age discrimination, just to kind of touch on that a little bit more, does happen on both ends, on the young end and the older end, but it actually begins really about the age of 40, just to give you an idea. And that really kind of wraps up the chronological, and I'll move on to the next one. The next style is actually one that I really like. In the past, a functional resume was kind of used if you had job gaps, because it was one that you could focus on your skills and you could actually choose not to include dates. However, I don't think by not including dates, you're fooling any HR professional. They're probably wondering why you didn't put dates on that. And so I do encourage, if you can, whether you have job gaps or not, make sure you include dates if you choose to do a functional resume. It really starts off the same. The whole top part is exactly the same. Where you see that it differs is under the experience and qualifications. So instead of under each job giving a description of what you did in the bullet points, what they're doing is they're kind of figuring out as a whole, I've done some fundraising, and under the fundraising umbrella, this is what I've done. Under the data organization and office management umbrella, this is what I've done. And if you did choose to do the maps, like I recommended in the beginning, you may find that, you have that customer service on 3 of your maps, right? And then from those 3 maps, you could have customer service as your header. And then you're choosing the other things you had listed under customer service from all your jobs and figuring out your most important ones. You're not going to have 100 bullets by any means. You're just going to pick like the top 5. And so you're kind of strategically vague when you word them. So like greeted customers, resolve customer complaints, recommended products and services, etc. And so then when they look down here at the work experience, they can see where exactly you worked and what your job title was, but they may not know which job you specifically got that skill at unless it's just immediately obvious, because what we're focusing on is the skill set, not necessarily where you worked or how long you worked there. That's not the bulk of the resume. And then you have your education and training in the same spot as well. What's nice about the functional is sometimes you can actually even modify it a little bit to kind of fit your story a little bit better. For example, I talked about if you have a job that you're wanting to show your skills, but technically that job, let's say, was 15 years ago, but it's relevant to the job you're wanting to apply to. So how do you show it without aging yourself? You can start your resume. You'd focus on the skills needed for that job. When it gets down to your work experience, you could write recent work experience, put in the job you're currently working or most recently worked and the dates of employment. And then you could put relevant work experience and put the name of the job. And on that one, you could just choose to leave the dates off. So whether you use the words recent experience, relevant experience, you could even use the word other experience. You can be a little bit more flexible. That's what's nice about the resume, is you do have some flexibility as to what you include and how you include it. The combination, I don't have it all mapped out here. This is just an example of what our combination template looks like. It's very similar to the other ones, especially at the top. The initial work experience looks similar to the chronological one. You're going to list your company, job title, start and end dates, and your duties. Where it differs is then the rest of the jobs, pretty much you're just listing where you worked, what your job title was, start and end date. This can be helpful in the case of you don't want to be repetitive. For example, I'm thinking of a specific type of industry, which this generally is helpful in, is CNA. They pretty much do the same thing at every job that they work at. The duties are the same. So instead of them saying it over and over and over, they can list the most recent company they were a CNA at, list the job duties, and then at the other work experience places, they can list where they worked, that they were a CNA from the start and end date. And that just prevents them from having to use the same duties over and over. So a combination may also be something that could potentially be helpful if you're not necessarily wanting to, or you don't feel like the job duties are important under each one. Some tools to help you with your resume creation include ownitonline.org. This tool is actually a career exploration tool. It tells you many things. It tells you about the type of job that you may be either looking at going into or that you've already done. And so you could use this if you're looking into a career, or you could use this to help with your resume, in which I recommend clients use in creating their resume all the time. And so you would put your last place of work or occupation here in the occupation quick search rather, and it would bring up information about that industry. It would give you tasks that are generally performed in that industry, which then can help you come up with the wording or the verbiage or the keywords that you might want to include on your resume. And so this is kind of like the ultimate cheat in helping you write your resume. Of course, you don't want to copy it verbatim, but it would help you in creating that. workforce-ks.com. If you go under the job seekers section, we do have a tips and template section in which you can find the templates that I've shown you, a chronological template, functional, and a combination to help you with getting started on creating that. kansasworks.biginterview.com/the big interview tool is an online tool that has curriculum or video lessons, in other words, that uses artificial intelligence-based virtual practice to help you not only practice for your interview, but they have a resume section on there as well. They have a place where you can actually have your resume scanned, and it uses artificial intelligence as well to evaluate that. And then they have a resume builder in it that you can use too, as well as they have resume lessons. So if you feel like you didn't get enough information from this course, you can do the big interview, register for an account, and then go to the My Resume section, which is here, and learn more. So you'll just want to go to this website and you'll have to create you an account to be able to take advantage of this tool. So it's kind of twofold. You can practice for interviewing or practice for your resume. kansasworks.com also has a resume builder within it, and you can choose to use that, or you can choose to just upload a resume that you've done within another tool or template, and it will actually save to your Kansas Works account so employers can see your resume online. And so really, to use the Kansas Works job search board to its fullest capacity, you do need to have a resume on there. So I encourage you to use kansasworks.com and upload your resume from whatever source you used, or you can try to create your resume within the tool. That concludes the resume start to finish part 1. Now we do have resumes start to finish part 2, in which clients can use our computers, and an instructor will be in the room to provide some assistance if you get stuck on the computer, etc. And so now you may still have more questions, possibly need your resume reviewed once you've done your resume, and you can always make an appointment with a workforce professional to review your resume as well. And I strongly encourage that, because the more feedback you get, the more you can adjust that resume, so that hopefully you will get more calls back than maybe that you've either been getting in the past, so that you can find work a little bit quicker. If you have any questions, please reach out to us here at the Workforce Center, and encourage you to take this information and register for the part 2 if you'd like to come in and use the computer during that dedicated time.